Everyone told Ethan Walker that his family ranch was nothing but snow rot and memories better left buried. But when his 5-year-old German Shepherd Max pulled him toward a narrow canyon behind the collapsed barn, Ethan discovered something that shattered every story he'd been told. Crouched in the frozen shadows was a dying Appaloosa, with hooves twisted into cruel spirals trapped beneath fallen stone. And what Ethan saw in that animal's eyes wasn't just pain. It was a mirror of the guilt he'd run from for 25 years, and in that moment he knew the choice ahead would either redeem him or ruin him forever. Please. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. A late winter wind sliced through the Snow Ridge Valley, dragging needles of ice across the Wyoming foothills as daylight thinned into a pale gray shiver. Ethan Walker sat inside his weather-beaten Ford Bronco, the heater coughing out half-warm breaths, the dashboard rattling each time the wind slapped the hood. At 45, Ethan carried the kind of rugged weariness that settled deep in the bones, broad shoulders slumped from carrying too many years of rescue missions, dark stubble along a jaw that always seemed clenched, and eyes the color of worn steel, forever scanning the horizon for threats, even when none existed. He had been a search and rescue specialist for the Federal Emergency Response Unit, a man whose instincts once saved lives in collapsed buildings and wildfire zones, until the day a mission went wrong, and 2 teammates, young men who had trusted him completely, never made it back. That failure lived inside him like a bruise that never fully healed, shaping him into someone quieter, someone who preferred distance rather than connection. His only constant was Max, the 5-year-old German Shepherd, curled in the passenger seat. Max had the musculature of a working dog, broad chest, lean legs, alert posture, yet his fur, a mix of deep black saddle and tan coat, softened his sharp silhouette. His amber eyes held an intelligence that often felt unsettlingly human, watching Ethan with the attentiveness of a second heartbeat. Max had been a duty dog trained for search detection and crisis response, but unlike many high-strung canines, he carried a calm focus that made him exceptional at sensing emotional shifts. He was not just a partner, he was the one presence Ethan could still put faith in. The sky outside was heavy with snow sagging low over the valley when Max suddenly snapped upright. His entire body stiffened, ears pricking to a razor point, nostrils flaring as if the wind carried something only he could hear. A low growl rumbled from deep in his chest, not aggressive, but urgent, the same tone he used when scenting human survivors through smoke and ash. Ethan frowned instinctively, scanning the tundra-like hills, though he saw only gusts carving patterns into the frost. "Easy, buddy," he murmured, but Max didn't settle. Instead, the dog turned sharply toward the northwest, toward the shadowed spine of Snow Ridge Mountain, toward the place Ethan had spent half his life avoiding. Ethan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. That mountain held the remains of the Walker Ranch, the property where he'd grown up, the place where a fire had devoured the main house 25 years ago. Official reports called it an accident. Ethan had never believed them entirely, though he tried very hard to pretend otherwise. The flames had taken both his parents, leaving behind a twisted skeleton of timber and memories too painful to face. He hadn't returned once since the funeral. Max pressed his front paws onto the center console, whining sharply, eyes locked with Ethan's. It wasn't a random reaction. Ethan had seen that look before during a rescue 6 years ago, when Max discovered a child trapped beneath a collapsed porch. Max only ever acted like this when he sensed life urgency or danger. "You can't possibly smell anything from here," Ethan muttered, though he felt the old dread tightening like a fist inside his chest. But Max insisted, nudging Ethan's wrist, then staring again toward Snow Ridge, as if begging him to move. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling something inside him, tilt, fear, resistance. Grief. He wasn't sure. "All right," he whispered, starting the engine. "We'll go, but only because you're driving me crazy." The road up the mountain was half buried under crusted snow, forcing Ethan to navigate the Bronco over frozen ruts carved by winter storms. As they ascended, memories dripped back, unwanted: his mother's gentle laugh, his father's strong hands repairing fence posts, the earthy smell of hay in the barn. Then the night of the fire, the frantic call, the ashes, the official statements, the unanswered questions. He swallowed hard. He wasn't ready to face any of it. But Max was already leaning forward, tail tip twitching with restless tension. As they reached the ridge, the first sight of the ranch hit Ethan like a physical blow. The remains of the main house sagged beneath the weight of decades, blackened beams jutting like ribs, the chimney crumbling into the snow. The barn was half collapsed, its red paint stripped away by storms, its roof caved inward. What once felt like home now looked like a battlefield after the fighting stopped. Ethan parked near the old fence line, barely stepping out of the Bronco before Max leapt down, nose to the earth. The dog inhaled sharply, then shot forward across the open yard with startling speed. "Max!" Ethan shouted, his voice cracking in the barren air. But Max didn't slow. He sprinted behind the remains of the barn, disappearing into a pale curtain of falling snow. Ethan chased after him, boots slipping over ice, breath burning in his lungs. His heart hammered, not from exertion, but from fear. Snow Ridge had taken enough from him once. He couldn't lose Max, too. The dog's tracks carved a clean path through the drifts leading toward the rear pastures, where the land sloped into a narrow wedge between two cliffs. Ethan pushed through thickets of dead sagebrush and the broken frame of an old corral gate. At the far edge of the property, where the earth cracked open into a dim, wind-carved cleft, he spotted Max standing perfectly still. The German shepherd's tail was lowered, his ears angled flat, his entire posture tense like a drawn bowstring. Ethan slowed, breath visible in shaky clouds. "Max," he whispered. Max didn't turn. He only stared deeper into the narrow canyon carved between sheer stone walls. Ethan stepped beside him, dread coiling cold and slow along his spine. Something was in there. Something he hadn't yet seen. Max let out a soft, warning whine. Ethan lifted his eyes, and in the shadowed throat of the canyon something shifted. Something alive. Chapter 1 ends. A thin veil of snow drifted through the narrow canyon as Ethan stepped forward, his heartbeat thudding against his ribs like a warning drum, and Max remained locked in a rigid stance beside him, the fur along his spine raised in a precise, disciplined ridge that told Ethan this wasn't just a scent of curiosity. This was danger mixed with something fragile, something living. As Ethan moved deeper into the stone corridor, the shadows parted just enough for him to see a trembling shape, wedged beneath a slanted slab of granite, a wild Appaloosa horse, its once white coat stained with dirt, and dried blood patches of brown and gray forming a map of hardship across its ribs. The horse was thin to the point of heartbreak, every bone visible beneath its skin muscles quivering violently with exhaustion and cold. Its hooves were the worst, twisted upward in grotesque spirals, long and curled like the horns of some tortured creature, a sign of months, maybe years, without proper care. Ethan felt a stab of shock, then anger, then a flicker of something that frightened him more than both recognition. The animal's eyes, a dark, glossy brown, clouded with pain, yet burning with relentless defiance, stared at him with the same fire he saw in the mirror every morning, the stubborn will to endure, even when everything had collapsed. Ethan lowered himself slowly, palms open, his breath visible in thin, shaky threads. "Easy. Easy, girl," he murmured, though he wasn't entirely sure the horse could hear him over the cold roaring through the canyon. Max moved to Ethan's side, sniffing the air and suddenly stiffened his head, snapping toward the snow-covered ground near the canyon entrance. Ethan followed the dog's gaze and saw them footprints fresh, crisp-edged, and deep enough to show the full tread of a heavy boot. Someone had been here recently, too recently. A hot pulse of unease rippled through Ethan's stomach. These weren't the tracks of hikers or tourists. They were deliberate, cautious steps leading directly toward the canyon, then turning back. His instincts, honed from years of rescue missions and disaster scenes, screamed that whoever had been here wasn't just passing by, they were watching something, or protecting something. Ethan exhaled slowly. Someone might return at any moment. He forced himself to refocus on the horse. The creature had its left hind leg trapped by a fallen rock slab, its flank dented where it had slammed against the stone trying to free itself. The cuts across its body varied from old scars to fresh wounds, suggesting a long struggle. Ethan touched the rock with gloved fingers, heavy, cold, immovable by bare hands. He pressed gently against the horse's neck and felt its skin twitch in fear, but it didn't lash out. Instead, it simply stared at him, breathing hard, nostrils flaring with thin steam. There was trust buried beneath the terror, the kind that only forms when an animal is too tired to resist but too proud to give up. As Ethan examined the area, he noticed the faint outline of a crevice behind the horse, narrow and vertical, almost invisible, unless someone was close enough to see the shift of light along the rock. Something glinted within that crack, a metallic shape dulled by time and dust. Ethan leaned, squinting through the dark slit, and realized it wasn't just a natural formation, it was an entrance, a man-made passage. And judging by the stonework and rusted pipe embedded beside it, it was old. A memory jolted through him like a cold shock. His father once mentioned a water vault on the property decades ago, a backup cistern built by the original homestead owners long before modern pumps. But his father had claimed it collapsed when Ethan was a child, sealed unusable. Yet here it was concealed intentionally, something his father never told him, something hidden behind a dying horse. Ethan's mouth went dry. The lie or omission tightened around his chest, stirring questions he'd buried for a quarter century. Why hide a water vault? Why lie about it? And how did this horse end up protecting the entrance, or being trapped by it? Max let out a sharp exhale, nudging Ethan's elbow. The dog's ears flicked, catching sounds Ethan couldn't hear, maybe wind, maybe movement, maybe someone approaching. Ethan felt the familiar flicker of combat-ready focus sliding into place, the mental shift he thought he'd left behind with his badge and uniform. He glanced back at the footprints again. Fresh, deep, leading straight to this canyon. Someone had been watching. Someone might return. Ethan studied the horse once more, the way its hooves curved unnaturally, the way its ribs lifted and fell, with a thin, fluttering breath, the way its eyes fixed on him like it was begging him to understand something bigger. A strange dread coiled in his stomach. Was this animal the reason his parents died in the fire? Had someone come for it back then? The same someone still walking these grounds now? Ethan placed a steadying hand on Max's neck. We're not alone. He whispered, his voice barely more than a breath carried by the cold. Max's muscles tightened beneath his palm. Ethan turned back to the horse, realizing with a sinking clarity that saving it was no longer just a moral impulse. It was a key to unraveling a truth his family had died with, a truth buried under snowstone and silence. As the wind howled through the canyon mouth, carrying flakes of ice like sparks from an unseen fire, Ethan felt his world tilt, reshaping itself into a path he hadn't intended to walk. He didn't yet know the weight of what he'd found. He didn't yet know the eyes that watched from the tree line. He didn't yet know that this broken horse had been the last thing his father protected. But he would. And the man responsible for the past, was still out there, watching, waiting, and very much alive. The storm clouds thickened over Snow Ridge as Ethan dragged an emergency tarp over the crude shelter he'd set up beside the canyon wall, the air sharpening with the metallic scent that always preceded a winter blast. Max circled the Appaloosa with careful, deliberate steps, ears forward, tail low, monitoring the trembling horse, the way he once assessed injured survivors during disaster missions. The horse, exhausted beyond resistance, lay on a thin pad of hay Ethan had scavenged from the remnants of the old barn. Its breathing came in shallow pulses, nostrils barely flaring as icy air drifted around them. Ethan's hands shook, not from cold, but from something older and harder, to name a fear that the secrets he'd run from his entire adult life were clawing their way back through the snow. When the first gust of real wind slammed into the canyon, Ethan forced himself to focus on what needed doing now, not on the questions rising like ghosts from his past. He guided Max into the small subterranean room tucked beneath the remains of the barn, a forgotten storm shelter his father had once used during the harshest winters. The wooden door groaned open, releasing a stale draft of dust and old earth. Ethan flicked his flashlight across the interior concrete walls, cracked with age shelves, warped and empty, and in the far corner, half buried under collapsed boards and debris, a dented green metal box. Even from a distance, he recognized military surplus gear. He had used identical containers for field kits during his SEAR years. Kneeling, he brushed away dirt with his sleeve. The box's surface was cold enough to numb his fingertips, and the stenciled markings, faded letters, and numbers were unmistakably his father's handwriting, the blocky, deliberate print of a man who double-checked everything and trusted almost nothing. When Ethan pried it open, the hinges shrieked in protest, revealing a set of items that shouldn't have been here, shouldn't have been hidden. A folded map of the property covered in red marks, circles, arrows, a small olive-green notebook stained with water damage around the edges, and a photograph curled from time. Ethan's throat tightened painfully as he lifted the photo. It showed his father decades younger, broad-shouldered, sun-browned, with thick dark hair, and a determined jawline dusted with stubble standing beside the same Appaloosa, now lying outside in the snow. Though back then the horse looked strong, its coat bright and glossy. The expression on his father's face wasn't posed pride or ranch owner pride. It was fierce protection, the kind Ethan remembered from childhood, only when his father believed something or someone was truly threatened. Ethan set the photo down, exhaling shakily as he opened the notebook. Inside, written in blunt strokes, was a single sentence that hit him like a blow. "If you find this, save it before they come back." The words vibrated in Ethan's chest like a struck bell. They were a warning, a direct one, and the phrasing made everything inside him tilt. His father had expected danger, had hidden evidence, had protected the horse. And then the fire happened. Ethan pressed a hand to his forehead, fighting the rising tide of guilt, grief, and anger. 25 years he had believed the story, a faulty lamp, a spark, an accident. 25 years he lived with the shame of not being home that night. But what if the fire had been deliberate? What if the horse, this broken, half-starved survivor outside, had been the reason Max touched Ethan's arm, with his nose sensing the shift in his breathing, the tremor in his shoulders? Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself upright. He didn't have the luxury of falling apart, not now. A living creature depended on him, and the storm was coming fast. He grabbed supplies from the shelves, old blankets, a rusted bucket, some rope, and hurried back outside. Snowflakes the size of feathers drifted from the darkening sky, settling onto the Appaloosa's tangled mane. Ethan wrapped the horse carefully, speaking in a low, steady tone, hoping his voice could offer what warmth the failing daylight could not. As he worked, the storm's pressure pressed against his eardrums, the air thickening with the promise of danger. He felt exposed out here like something was watching from beyond the tree line. Max suddenly stiffened again, nose to the wind posture, sharp and alert. "What is it?" Ethan whispered, though the cold had stolen most of his breath. Max took 3 steps towards the slope leading to the forest, muscles taut, eyes fixed. Ethan followed his line of sight and froze. At the edge of the distant ridge, where snowfall blurred shapes into gray silhouettes, something glinted. A flicker, a pinpoint flash. Ethan squinted. It came again, quick, metallic, deliberate, light bouncing off glass, specifically off a lens. Someone was using a scope. Someone was watching them. A cold far deeper than the storm seeped into Ethan's spine. The footprints, the hidden vault, the warning in his father's notebook, the injured horse. None of this was coincidence. His pulse hammered with the clarity of a man realizing he was back in a battlefield, different landscape, different enemy, same threat. Max growled low, and rumbling the kind of sound he reserved for danger that had intent behind it. Ethan placed a steadying hand on the dog's back and forced himself not to look directly at the ridge again. If someone was watching, reacting visibly would only confirm he'd seen them. Instead, he kept his movements measured, controlled, pretending to adjust the tarp around the horse. But every nerve in his body burned with the certainty that the person behind that lens wasn't a hiker or hunter. It was someone connected to the same shadow his father had feared. Someone who might have been there the night of the fire. Someone who wanted this horse silenced or captured. And they were close. Too close. As the first roar of the blizzard rolled through the valley, Ethan tightened his grip on the rope heart, pounding with a realization he did not dare say aloud. Whoever had once come for the horse had come back, and they were watching. Right now, the blizzard raged through the night like a furious animal clawing at the earth, its winds howling against the storm shelter, as Ethan tightened the last wool blanket around the trembling Appaloosa, his fingers numb despite the heat pack shoved inside his gloves, while Max pressed close to him for warmth, his breath visible in sharp, steaming bursts. Every few minutes, Ethan checked Max's ears and paws, classic danger zones for frostbite, his worry deepening with each icy gust that seeped through the old wooden seams. The storm shelter groaned under the weight of the gale snow piling against the door with a muffled hiss, and Ethan's mind churned with a mixture of fear, guilt, and simmering anger. He had been in storms before, hurricanes, wildfires, collapsed buildings, but this one felt different. This one felt intentional, as if the night itself were trying to erase evidence, erase tracks, erase lives. Max paced in tight circles, his nose twitching and head snapping toward the door every time the wind shifted, until suddenly near midnight, the dog froze. Ethan didn't hear anything at first, but Max's body told him all he needed to know. Posture locked, front legs planted, tail, stiff ears pushed so far forward they trembled. Then came the sound. Soft, sharp, and unmistakable, a single high-pitched chirp. The K9 distress signal Max only used when danger was less than a heartbeat away. Ethan reached instinctively for the old crowbar he'd kept near the wall, adrenaline snapping through him like an electric wire. The door rattled not from the wind this time, but from something pushing against it. Max positioned himself between Ethan and the threshold hackles, raised in a precise ridge from neck to tail. Ethan whispered, "Stay," but Max's muscles remained coiled, and ready eyes glass bright with focus. When the door finally creaked open, spilling a wave of snow and frigid air into the room, a tall figure appeared in the blizzard's white glow, a silhouette built from arrogance and cold intentions. Duke Larson stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots, his breath rolling out in thick clouds. Duke was in his early 50s, a broad-shouldered rancher with the kind of build that came from decades of hauling hay and fencing line. His face was weather-beaten and harsh, framed by a coarse salt and pepper beard trimmed too neatly for a man who claimed to live off the land. His nose was crooked from an old bar fight he liked to brag about, and a faded scar ran from his left ear to his jaw, a souvenir of a horse accident he blamed on everyone except himself. Duke's eyes, pale, icy blue, held a cruel spark, the kind that came from a lifetime of entitlement and a belief that everything could be bought or taken by force. His thick coat was fur-lined, expensive, out of place in the rural honesty of Wyoming winters, and his gloves were spotless despite the storm hinting he hadn't been out here for ranch work. He carried himself like someone who expected the world to get out of his way. Ethan felt an old resentment stir. Duke had once tried to buy the Walker Ranch after the fire, circling the ruins like a vulture waiting to pick at bones. Ethan had refused, and Duke had never forgiven him. Duke smirked when he saw Ethan, his voice rough but smug. "Didn't expect to find you up here, Walker. Thought you'd finally learned to stay gone." Max growled, not loudly, but low and deadly. Duke gave the dog a mocking glance. "Still got that mutt, huh? Shame. He's wasted out here." Ethan stepped forward, placing a hand on Max's collar. His own voice came out steady despite the storm inside him. "What do you want?" Duke's smile widened just enough to show he enjoyed dragging out the moment. "Not the land. Not anymore." His eyes flicked toward the Appaloosa curled under the blankets. "I want that." Ethan's muscles tensed, and Max leaned forward like a drawn arrow. Duke removed one glove with exaggerated calm, revealing a hand marked by calluses, but decorated with a large silver ring shaped like an eagle, too ornate for a rancher, but fitting for a man who hid behind wealth and reputation. "You don't understand what that animal is worth," he said. "Not to you. But to the right buyer." He chuckled under his breath. "You're sitting on something bigger than land, Walker." Ethan straightened, heartbeat, thundering so hard he felt it in his throat. Duke shouldn't have known anything about the horse. And yet he spoke with certainty. "How long have you been watching this place?" Ethan asked quietly. Duke shrugged. "Long enough?" His gaze hardened with a predatory focus. "You should have stayed away." "This isn't your fight." Ethan felt something snap inside him, not fear, but a clarity sharpened by the blizzard and the closeness of danger. "If my father died because of this horse," he said, "then it sure as hell is my fight." Duke's expression twitched, anger, surprise, something else. Then he stepped back towards the doorway, snow curling around his boots. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice dropping into a threat. "Hand over the horse and I walk away." Ethan didn't move. Neither did Max. Duke's pale eyes narrowed into slits. "Have it your way." He whistled a sharp, piercing signal that cut through the storm like a blade. From outside, through the roar of wind, Ethan heard footsteps. More than one. Heavy boots crunching through snow, and then shadows appeared behind Duke, broad shapes moving with purpose, silhouettes of men who weren't here for negotiation. Duke hadn't come alone. The morning after the storm broke, with a pale yellow light that spilled across the Snow Ridge Valley like a quiet apology for the night's violence, the world transformed into a glittering field of white, so bright it stung Ethan's eyes as he stepped outside the weather-beaten shelter. Max walking at his side, with a stiff but determined gait, the German shepherd's breath curling upward in delicate streams. Ethan's body ached from the cold, and from the confrontation with Duke's men, bruises blooming beneath his shirt like dark fingerprints. Yet there was a steadiness inside him he had not felt in years, an anchor returning to its rightful place. The battered Appaloosa stood beneath the crude lean-to at the far side of the yard, its patchy coat rising and falling with slow breaths, ears flicking whenever Max got too close, but no longer trembling from the fever. Ethan felt an odd swell of pride, not unlike the feeling he once had when pulling a survivor from collapsed concrete, the quiet reassurance that his efforts had mattered. As he checked the horse's bandaged leg, Mac suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked sharply towards the driveway, where the distant growl of engines crawled through the silence. Ethan stiffened, but this time the approaching sound carried no menace, only the heavy churn of county snowplows clearing a path through drifts as tall as a man. Behind them rolled a dark sheriff's SUV, its black paint reflecting shards of winter light. Ethan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He placed a hand on Max's back. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "These ones aren't here to kill us." The snowplow rumbled to a stop, followed by the SUV. Sheriff Melanie Brooks stepped out first, a woman in her early 40s with a lean runner's build and sharp, observant eyes the color of storm clouds. Her brown hair cut just above the shoulders to maintain easy control in the fierce Wyoming winds was tucked beneath a gray beanie embroidered with the county emblem. Her face bore the calm strength of someone who had seen the worst outcomes too many times to be shaken easily, and yet also carried a tired kindness, the sort that came from delivering bad news door to door during previous winters. Melanie had always been well-liked in Snow Ridge. She never raised her voice, never rushed to judgment, and her quiet presence often soothed more than any speech could. She approached Ethan slowly, her breath puffing in even rhythms. "Walker." She said, her tone caught between professional composure and mild disbelief we came expecting a body count. Ethan gave a wry half-smile that didn't quite reach the bruised places beneath his ribs. "Sorry to disappoint." Max stood squarely beside him, tail low but alert, watching Melanie with steady amber eyes. The sheriff's gaze softened when she looked at the dog. Max Wright heard he used to track missing hikers for federal SR. Ethan nodded. "He saved my life more times than I can count." One of the deputies climbing out of the SUV, Deputy Ron Keller, a burly man with sandy hair and a ruddy complexion, paused when he spotted the Appaloosa. Keller wasn't much for talking, but everyone knew him as dependable and gentle with animals despite his intimidating size. He whistled under his breath. "That horse should have died days ago." Ethan rested a hand on the Appaloosa's neck. He almost did. Sheriff Melanie's expression shifted from concern to the crisp precision of an investigator. "We found tire tracks leading toward Duke Larson's property. I'm guessing you already know something's off." Ethan felt his jaw tighten. "Duke and his men came here last night. They were after this horse. They knew more than they should have." Melanie's eyes narrowed. "And they assaulted you." "They tried," Ethan said. "Max handled most of it." Max lifted his chin proudly. The sheriff exhaled a sharp sigh. "Larson's been on our radar for years. Illegal trapping, shady land offers, missing livestock from neighboring counties. Nothing ever stuck." She kicked lightly at a patch of ice. "Maybe this time it will." The deputies moved through the property, taking photos, documenting boot prints, and recovering a dropped metal tool, an old-style cattle prod modified with illegal voltage. Ethan felt a cold anger coil in his chest, the same feeling he'd battled during his SAR days when bad men took advantage of the vulnerable. "What happens now?" he asked. Melanie closed her notebook. "Larson will be charged. We have enough to make it difficult for him to breathe, much less operate." She paused, studying Ethan's face, and her voice softened. "You held your ground out here. Most wouldn't have survived the storm." Ethan looked toward the broken barn, the shattered memories, the ghostly outline of everything he'd run from. "I didn't stay because I'm brave," he said quietly. "I stayed because I'm tired of running." Melanie nodded with understanding, deeper than words. "Then maybe it's time you rebuild this place." She turned to leave, but stopped halfway. "Ethan, if you need help, the town owes your family more than a few favors. You're not alone out here unless you choose to be." Those last words struck him harder than the wind ever could. When the vehicles rolled back down the drive, the valley settled again into a deep, serene hush. Ethan stood in the snow, staring at the land that had once been his burden, but now somehow felt like a lifeline. He spent the afternoon hauling boards, clearing snow, and straightening the battered hinges of the front gate. Max followed him everywhere, occasionally nudging his knee as if to remind him he didn't have to do it alone. By sunset, the old gate stood upright again, and Ethan mounted a new cedar sign he had carved by lantern light during sleepless nights. The words were simple, etched deep into the rich grain Second Chance Ranch, a sanctuary for the lost. Ethan stepped back, breath-catching in his chest. Those words weren't just for the horse. They weren't for Max. They were for him. As twilight painted the snow ridge peaks in shades of lavender and gold, Ethan settled onto the front porch of the partially rebuilt cabin. The wood creaked beneath him, familiar and grounding. Max curled beside his feet, head resting on Ethan's boot, his eyes soft with a loyalty that needed no explanation. The Appaloosa grazed weakly near the fence, still fragile but undeniably alive, silhouetted against the mountains that had shaped generations of walkers. Ethan inhaled the crisp evening air, his breath warm against the cold. "We made it," he whispered. Max's tail thumped lightly. The sun dipped low, setting their shadows long across the snow, and for the first time in decades, Ethan felt the quiet hum of a life that wasn't haunted, wasn't borrowed, wasn't running. It was beginning. A new home. A new mission. A place where the lost man, dog, or horse could finally breathe again. Sometimes the greatest miracles arrive quietly, an unexpected second chance, a wounded spirit healed, or a path lit just when the world feels darkest. Ethan, Max, and the rescued horse remind us that God often works through small mercies, steady courage, and the love we choose to give every day. May this story inspire you to protect what is fragile, lift those who fall, and believe that redemption is never out of reach. If this journey touched your heart, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And may God bless every viewer with strength, warmth, and grace in the days ahead.